welcome all to this, our third in our series on Hezekiah and the deadly virus. Hopefully everyone has been along with us on the first couple, but we'll do a quick little bit of background. Ruth asked me in particular if I could quickly go over a couple of the things in Isaiah chapter 7, again in regards to the impending judgment and the shortening of the dates and time periods that are there. So I'll just quickly run through that again because it does lead us into this next session, which we're looking at the theme of contact tracing. So if you remember in our first instance, we looked at the outbreak of this virus and we looked at the context of it being like a disease of leprosy, and it really came about from the very outset, from the time of Solomon, and then followed on into the times of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. And the virus swept through the northern kingdom to the point where God was about to bring judgment on the northern kingdom. But then it came right down into Judah, into the sanctuary, into the temple in particular, through Hezekiah's father, Ahaz. And in Isaiah chapter 7, we get this incredible parable. And there's two symbols which are used frequently through this section of Isaiah, particularly through Isaiah chapter 6 through to Isaiah chapter 10. And one of the key themes is this symbol of two different types of water that are being used. And Ahaz is given a choice to choose between these two different types of water. And the waters of Siloam, which is where Isaiah met Ahaz to give him these opportunities to choose God or to choose the arm of the flesh. And Ahaz made some very bad choices in Isaiah chapter 7. So you'll remember that in Isaiah chapter 7 verse 11, Isaiah goes to Ahaz and says, ask a sign of the Lord God, let it be deep as Sheol, as high as heaven. And there's something really interesting in the phraseology that's used here for these choices. Because if you looked at the entire land of Israel, in particular, the land that was promised to Abraham from the river Euphrates to the river Egypt, even into the heights of Lebanon, the land itself carries a parable. So as you go up through Israel, you get higher and higher into the heights of Lebanon, into the mountains of Lebanon. And then on top of the mountains of Lebanon are the cedars of Lebanon. And they are the heights of the highest living thing in this parable. And when you come down from the heights of Lebanon to these high, lofty trees, you come down, down, down until you get to the Dead Sea, which is the bottom and the lowest point. And the symbol of Sheol, or the depth of the ocean, is like quite a parable as to the in the depths of water. You remember the phrase, your sins shall be thrown into the depths of the water. So this is quite a symbol that's given in terms of these choices that Ahaz has to make. And what's interesting in this first one is that phrase there, where Isaiah says to Ahaz, choose, make a choice, and God will give you a sign of deliverance. If you choose to wait for me, I will prove to you that I will deliver you. And of course, Ahaz refused the sign. But the words that are used here, as high as heaven, it's the same idea in Isaiah chapter 6, where it says, in the year Uzziah died, I saw the Lord high and lifted up, exalted in his glory. So that's the same idea as God set high as a king on his throne in the heavens. And what's really interesting is that particular Hebrew phrase, high as heaven, those two Hebrew words are only found in one other place in the whole of the Bible. And if you're taking notes, it's 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 23. And the story of 1 Samuel chapter 10, verse 23 is the story of Israel rejecting God as their king. So you got this picture in Isaiah of God high and lifted up on his throne over Israel. And in Samuel, it says that God came through Samuel and told the nation that they had rejected God as their king, and they chose themselves a man. And when Saul came out and was presented before the people, it says he stood higher than all the people, above the people, higher upwards. And that's the only other time that phrase, high as heaven, high as exalted, is used, which is interesting, isn't it? They rejected God, their king, and chose what they could see. They rejected the invisible and chose the visible deliverance of a man of flesh. So they rejected the hand of God and chose the hand of man. So that was the first sign that Ahaz was given. And because he rejected this parable goes, and it says in Isaiah chapter 8, because this people have rejected the waters of Siloam, they've rejected the sign that God offered Ahaz that flowed gently, and they rejoice over Rezin the son of Remaliah, because that's what they've chosen. Then God says, well, I will bring that. I will bring against them the waters of a river, mighty and many, the king of Assyria and all his glory and power, but it's going to overflow its channels and it's going to go right through the land. So that's the parable that's going on in this section in Isaiah. The impending judgment is shortened. So you've got three kind of date stamps which are given in this parable that's taking place. The first is in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 8. God says to Ahaz through Isaiah, within 65 years, Ephraim, that's the northern kingdom who Ahaz was so worried about, will be shattered from being a people. Then he says in Isaiah chapter 7, verse 16, about the child Emmanuel that was given to Ahaz as a sign. Before the boy knows how to refuse evil and choose good. So the suggestion here is 12 years old, because that was the age of responsibility of a Jewish boy. So before he can discern really between right and wrong, the land whose two kings you're afraid of will be deserted. So you can see how the first part of the prophecy says it's going to happen within 65 years. And then another part of the prophecy says, well, it's going to happen perhaps within 12 years. And then it says in Isaiah chapter 8, verse 4, concerning the second son of Isaiah, before the boy knows how to cry, my father, my mother, which I would guess is well and truly less than 2 years old, before a child can say, mummy, daddy, the wealth of Damascus, the spoil of Samaria shall be carried away by the king of Assyria. So you can see how you've gone from 65 to 12 to perhaps 2 years. And remember, Mahal-shalal-Hashbaz's name, Isaiah's second son, means speed the prey, hasten the spoil, make it quicker. And you can see this judgment is going, getting faster and faster. Because of faithlessness, God is going to bring this judgment. And it's true that within a couple of years, Pul, or Tiglath-Pileser, came down into the northern kingdom and took control of the northern kingdom of both Syria and Israel and the north, Ephraim. So both Damascus and Samaria were taken control by the king of Assyria in fulfillment of this prophecy. So that's just a little quick sort of detail. We did talk a little bit about who the Emmanuel was in Isaiah chapter 7. It was definitely the Emmanuel child in its first instance was definitely given as a sign to Ahaz, for Ahaz to see. The Lord himself will give you a sign, Ahaz. The virgin shall conceive and bear a son, and before the child is old enough to choose between good and evil. So clearly this child had some application in the days of Ahaz. Of course, we know the ultimate fulfillment is in Jesus, and that's the principal fulfillment of the prophecy, but there was a primary application to the prophecy which happened in the days of Ahaz. So the suggestion is it was either the birth of Hezekiah as a sign, or it's another child which we don't know much about, one of Isaiah's children, a third child. I tend to believe it's Hezekiah, but it's kind of a whole study on its own. I think probably the easiest way for me to explain that the Emmanuel child is Hezekiah is he's spoken of again in chapter 8, where it says when the Assyria comes into the land, he's going to come into the breadth of Emmanuel's land, and the great conflict is going to happen between Emmanuel in the land and the king of Assyria. And that conflict comes to a head between this child, which means God is with us, and the king of Assyria when it comes into the land. So when you follow through chapter 8, you'll see the head-to-head conflict is between Emmanuel and the king of Assyria. And of course, that was Hezekiah. Certainly not Isaiah's second son. So that's just the reason why I think the Emmanuel child is Hezekiah. A bit of a study on its own. So Ahaz chose, if you like, refused the waters of Siloam, and he chose instead to go to Assyria and ask for help. So he chose Euphrates over Siloam. He chose a raging river and flood, great and powerful, over the waters of Siloam. And the reason why, of course, is Ahaz thought, well, you know, when you look at the waters of Siloam, they just trickle down. They didn't seem to be much. That's like a little creek that's doing nothing. But when you look at Assyria, wow, look how powerful and mighty that is. And it's like, you know, his focus was on what he could see, which was much like Israel in the choosing of Saul. So the other symbol that is being used in this section of Isaiah, as we said, is the symbol of the trees of Lebanon, the cedars of Lebanon, and it follows through right through this section of Isaiah. In fact, it goes right through to chapter 11, and it comes up numerous times. And if you're going through a concordance, you can look at these themes of the cedars of Lebanon in this section of Isaiah. And this was like the most powerful symbol, natural symbol within the land of Israel, the greatest living thing, if you like. And it says here in Isaiah chapter 2, the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up, and it shall be brought down against the cedars of Lebanon, high and lifted up. So you can see how these trees are a symbol of man in his pride and in his power and in his strength. And God says, I will bring down these trees. And the way he was going to do it, and even Sennacherib himself identified with this prophecy. So remember last week we looked at the fact of the cleansing of the leper, that part of the process was to shave the head. Well, that was the symbol of what Sennacherib and the Assyrian would do. And so Sennacherib says in Isaiah 37, with my chariots, I have gone up to the heights of the mountains, to the far recesses of Lebanon, to cut down its tallest cedars and its choicest cypresses. And this is what the Sennacherib did. He went through and he literally cut down all the trees. But the boasting arrogance of Sennacherib was that he was destroying every power, every king, every monarch was being cut down by his hand. Just an interesting aside that, you know, under the law of Moses, Israel was told when they went and besieged any city, they were never to cut down the trees, because the trees were a symbol of life for the people. Assyria was the cruelest nation that had ever existed to that day, and they cut down every tree. They had what was called, you know, the almost like a burnt earth or clean earth policy, depicted by the locust, really. And there's many that believe the first application of Joel and the locusts is really about the Assyrian, because what's in front of them is green and prosperous, and what behind them was nothing. They just destroyed everything. But the point in Isaiah is this, is God was saying that, well, actually, Sennacherib, you're my axe. I've given you power. I gave you the strength to do these things. And so Isaiah chapter 10 is just, I love this parable in Isaiah chapter 10. I remember when I was young, I used to go to the AMP shows, and I was always fascinated by watching the axemen and the competitions that were going on there. And, you know, for a young boy, there's nothing more sort of exhilarating to see. You know, you see these guys, and they would bring them out in their different classes, and you get sort of the ones which were in the small sort of weight class, and they had these tiny little axes, and the highlight of the day was when they brought out the big boys, and these were the guys that have been in the forest, and man, like, their arms were huge, and when they opened up and their axe was just huge, you know, the little guy couldn't even pick up the big guy's axe, and like, it would only take them like 3 or 4 smashes of this axe to just cut through these logs, and you could just see the chips flying everywhere. And it was like, they are so powerful. But in this picture in Isaiah chapter 10, it's kind of funny when you think about it. It's like, you know, you see this massive axe, and you see this, you know, powerful person swinging the axe. And it's like the axe suddenly turns around and looks and says, oh, look how powerful I am. I am so powerful. And the axe suddenly thinks that it's powerful on its own. But of course, you know, if no one's wielding the axe is useless. It can't do a thing. So this picture of Isaiah chapter 10, it says, does the axe take over from the person that swings it and turn around and say, oh, I'm stronger than you are? But that is exactly what Sennacherib, or the Assyrian, was going to do. So God was going to give him the power, give him the strength for one purpose, to punish Israel. He was going to come down into the land, and he was going to swing that axe, and then he would turn against the God of heaven, against Yahweh. And he says, who is Yahweh to stand up against me? And that was literally the words of Sennacherib. And with his pride and arrogance, the axe was going to be turned against him. And so you get this other little story in Isaiah chapter 10, again, of God now turning against the might and power of the Assyrian. And it says in verse 17 and 18, Israel's light will burst. By the way, this is the Message translation. I love it for this little section. It's kind of cool. It says, Israel's light will burn into conflagration. The Holy One will explode into a firestorm, and in one day will burn to cinders every last thorn bush of Assyria. Everything's going to go. He will destroy the splendid trees, the lush gardens, and the Assyrian body and soul shall waste away to nothing. And listen to this last phrase in terms of our context: as a disease-ridden invalid. Why is that? Because the sin of Israel, of Jeroboam the son of Nebat, which began this plague of leprosy, was pride. The second he stood up and says, I can offer in place of God, what happened was God smote him and his arm shriveled up and he lost all his power in his arm. That disease went right through the nation of Israel till Uzziah stood up in Judah and said, I can offer in place of God. And boom, he was smitten with leprosy from head to foot. Now God's using Sennacherib, and Sennacherib comes down and he says, I'm even greater than God. And God says, well, I'm going to wipe you out like a disease-ridden man, because he was full of the same illness. If you like, he'd come into the land of Israel and he got contaminated. I'd say that's probably the scenario. He came down and he contracted the virus that existed in Israel and Judah, the virus of pride. So the ESV says, the glory of his forest and his fruitful land, the Lord will destroy both soul and body, and it will be as a sick man wastes away. And like this phrase is unique again, and it's got this idea of a sick, diseased person melting, like this melting. And the reason why is because whilst Assyria was like an axe chopping down trees, this is a picture of a forest fire, a flame which is going to burn. And God's going to not, like, it's going to destroy everything of the Assyrian. There'll be nothing left. And so you get this picture of the Assyrian just burnt to nothing. It's a really interesting symbol or metaphor which is used when looking at the story of Hezekiah. Interesting, I believe Jesus picks this up. You know, there's nothing more powerful, as I say, when you look at, you know, a man, a mighty military warrior with an axe. And in Matthew chapter 10, verse 24, Jesus says, is a disciple above his teacher, or a servant above his master? In other words, shall the axe boast itself against him that hews? And then he says, don't fear him who kills the body, but cannot kill the soul. Remember what it said in Isaiah? I will destroy both his body and soul. That's what God says of the Assyrian. I will utterly destroy him. There'll be nothing left. I'll burn a fire and I'll destroy both his body and soul. And Jesus says, rather fear him who can destroy both body and soul in Gehenna, and a burning fire. And I believe Jesus is making connection straight back to the story which is in Isaiah chapter 10, the might and the power of the Assyrian. Oops, sorry, I've just lost things for a moment. Right. Hezekiah is going to pick up this same analogy and metaphor when he talks to the children of Israel and encourages them in the face of the Assyrian. He's going to say to them, be strong and courageous. And we'll look at this again next week. But it's interesting what he says, be strong and courageous. Don't be afraid nor dismayed of the king of Assyria. Do not fear him which can destroy the body, because or the horde or the mighty army that is with him, because there are more with us than him. For with him is an arm of flesh. See that sort of scenario again? It's all about the arm of the flesh. And we remember this, don't we? Where do we see this symbol of the arm of the flesh? In the story of Jeroboam, the son of Nebat, who made Israel to sin. The choice that says, my arm and my power can deliver me. And he stood up against God and said, I'll do it my way. And all of a sudden his arm shriveled up and he lost all power and strength in it. So I've got a quick little exercise for you to do in your bubbles. Here's a picture, a little picture, an analogy that you can see here on my slide, sink or swim. What I'd like you to do in your bubble, here's your challenge, is where are these two symbols being picked up from? Where do you think the two stories are? If you can find quotes relating to these two things, and you can either put it in your chat box, or if somebody likes to turn on their microphone and say where they are. So find the quote, and we'll give you a couple of minutes to see if you can make the connection here. Can't see anything in the chat box yet. People still with us? I'm not talking to myself, am I?
No, we're here.
Hello?
No, we're here.
Good.
The axe head relates to the axe head swimming under Elisha, but I don't know the quote.
Very good. So that's a good one. Thank you, Ruth. So the axe head floating, which is, as we said, is a really interesting symbol, as we said, of the power and the might of what God uses as his tool. And that's in 2 Kings chapter 6. And it's the story of, you know, the axe head falling into the water. What do you think the symbol of the arm reaching out of the water here is?
Would that be Peter trying to walk on water?
Yes, very good, Leo. Well done. So that's Matthew chapter 14, verse 30. Now, what's interesting about both these symbols, of course, is it was very unnatural for an axe head to swim, and it's pretty unnatural for somebody to walk on water. This is defying the laws of nature. But the symbols or the parables in these two stories are very much the same. When you think about what they were doing with the axe, in the story of 2 Kings, it says they were building a place for the sons of the prophets. They were building a house of the Lord. And the axe head got lost in the water, and a stick was thrown in, which lifted the axe head out of the water. And it's a picture, of course, unless God builds the house, you labor in vain. And God is able to lift you out of the water. And Peter, of course, he's on the water and he's sinking. And why was he sinking? It's because he turned and he looked at a storm instead of looking at Jesus. And if you like the symbol, in front of him was a picture of the waters of Siloam with Jesus, who said, peace, be still, who was gentle, and he was lowly in spirit. And behind Peter was this raging storm. And the second you take your focus off the waters of Siloam and you look at the raging storm of the Euphrates, you'll sink. So this is a picture of another little parable of what was about to take place in Israel. And this psalm here is a beautiful psalm because it's the one of the songs of degrees, Psalm 124. And again, we'll probably look at this on our last study again at this psalm, compiled by Hezekiah. And it says, if the Lord hadn't been on our side when people rose up against us, then we would have been swallowed up alive. And the flood would have swept over us, and the torrent would have gone over us, and we would have been drowned in the raging water. So that's just a picture, if you like, of the story of how Hezekiah saw it. He saw the floods coming up, and like Peter, he reached out, Lord, save us, and he was lifted out of the raging waters, just like Peter, and caused float. So those two symbols, I know this is kind of a long background, but it helps to lead us into the story of what Hezekiah is going to do. So again, with these two symbols of the cedars of Lebanon and the waters of Siloam, what acts upon the trees to make them move or shake? Here's another little quote from 2 Samuel chapter 5, and this is a story of God's deliverance. And when you go back to the story of God's deliverance, David is saying there's two occasions where he's going to go and fight the Philistines, and he asks God through the Urim and Thummim, shall I go up and strike down the Philistines? And God says, yes, go up. And David goes up and he's successful. And then on another occasion, he says, shall I go up? And God says, no, not this time. He says, you go behind, and when you hear the sound in the top of the trees, when you hear the wind in the top of the trees, the Lord will strike down the army of the Philistines. And so the symbol of the invisible spirit moving in the trees was a symbol of divine deliverance. And it's the same symbol which is used with the waters as well. And it's right from the very beginning. Genesis chapter 1, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was on the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved on the waters. And this is the picture of the divine deliverance that you can't see delivering. Now, I've used these slides in a previous talk, but as we come into the introduction now in terms of what Hezekiah does, I just thought we'd look at this one again, because I think the waters of Siloam are the beautiful parable, and there's a great theme in the story of H2O here, and this is kind of just a cute little story about humility, harmony, openness, 2 H's, 1 O. And in this first section with Hezekiah, I want to show you how that Hezekiah was so much like the waters of Siloam that flowed softly. He was a symbol of God's deliverance for the people. And Hezekiah demonstrated these qualities in the most remarkable way from the very first day when he becomes king. And when we think about humility, which is what we're going to look at right now, in contrast to the cedars of Lebanon and the power and the might of man, and the axe boasting himself against him that heweth, or Jeroboam the son of Nebat, or Uzziah, who all thought, I'll do it my way, Hezekiah was incredibly humble. He totally focused on doing it God's way. He remained grounded in everything he did, and you'll find that the beauty of the waters of Siloam is they always go down. They always follow a downward path to their destination, and they have direction, but it flows downward, not upward. Whereas of the king of Assyria, the Euphrates, it says it would rise up like a flood and overflow the banks, and you get this tsunami, which is like water rising up. This is the waters of Siloam that flowed softly down. The other thing about the waters of Siloam, the gentle streams, is they're a life source for all plants, all animals. An amazing diversity of life shares in the rich provision which is given by waters of life. And we'll look at how that fits Hezekiah so beautifully. totally indiscriminate. Anybody that comes, come unto me, all ye that labor and heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. And it's a picture of the wonderful way in which Hezekiah was going to offer to all of Israel the opportunity of life. And the other amazing thing is, which is quite challenging in the story of Hezekiah, because everything was on the clock. Hezekiah had a very limited lifespan. He didn't have lots of time. But water isn't governed by time. Water is patient. Water achieves its destination. And that was the story that God was giving to Ahaz, is if you trust in me, I'll deliver. Might take time. And of course, the other thing about water is that it's the symbol of purification. And in the purifying of a leper or any contagious virus, it is the key ingredient to dealing with a contamination, an outbreak. And we've probably heard Jacinda just enough now saying, wash your hands, stay safe and be kind and stay in your bubbles. But we've been told over and over again that, you know, to deal with a deadly virus, we need to constantly be washing. And it's interesting when we think about, you know, what Hezekiah inherited. So we looked at this. Hezekiah inherited a nation which was so corrupt because of Ahaz. And Ahaz's false worship had established this point where everything in the temple had been defiled. He gathered all the vessels of God, he cut in pieces the vessels of God, and he shut the doors to the Lord's house. Interesting, isn't it? You know, like when everything went wrong for Ahaz, the answer was to blame God. You know, God continuously said to Ahaz from when he was just a boy, if you want my help, just ask. And Ahaz says, no, I'm not going to ask your help. I'm going to ask for Assyria instead. And constantly God was appealing to him. So he went to Assyria, he went to Damascus, he went everywhere seeking support and help. And all of those nations, instead of helping him, punished him and brought him low. And so what he did as a result of all of that is he says, well, I blame God for it. It's God's fault. All of this is God's fault. And so he shut up the temple. No one's allowed to worship God anymore because he did this to me. Isn't it interesting that God constantly says, if you want my help, just ask. And he refused God's help. And when he got pain because of it, he blamed God. I wonder how often we tend to do this in our life without really thinking about it. How often when things, you know, aren't going well, without necessarily pointing the finger, we blame God. So Hezekiah gets this message. Day one, Ahaz dies. Yay, the whole nation was really happy. They made no burial or no glory for this king that had brought Israel low. They just took him out and they chucked him in a grave, and there was no big celebration or mourning. They just said good riddance. But it's almost like on the day of Ahaz's death, on the inauguration of Hezekiah, Micah the Morashite comes storming into the temple and makes this prophecy that says, because of the corruption of Ahaz, this is what's going to happen. He says Jerusalem's going to be plowed like a field and become a heap. And here's the humility of Hezekiah. It says, did Hezekiah put him to death because of this? No, he repented of his evil. And Hezekiah is going to try to reverse everything that Ahaz has done to the nation. And his humility is seen again in 2 Chronicles 29, and constantly you'll see this beautiful picture of Hezekiah where it says, and all the king that were present before him bowed themselves in worship. And in contrast, as I said, to Jeroboam, to Uzziah, to Sennacherib, Hezekiah remained grounded, humble, and he was patient. So here's a little quote here. Lord, give me patience now. Luke chapter 21, by your patience possess your souls. What does it mean to wait for the salvation of the Lord? What does it mean to trust in God? Does it mean to sit back and do nothing? Well, in Hezekiah's case, that couldn't be further from the truth. For Hezekiah, who trusted in God, he knew judgment was coming. Micah the Morashite said, Jerusalem's going to be plowed like a heap. Judgment was hanging over the nation. And so Hezekiah knew that he had to act, and he had to act fast. And I think the story of Hezekiah's actions are just mind-boggling. And the first step to change, to deciding that you need to change your life or you need to make a difference, is to decide that you're not going to stay in the same place. You're not going to stay where you are. And Hezekiah began to make a change, and he began to make it immediately. See, between yesterday's regrets and tomorrow's dreams are today's opportunities. And it says of Hezekiah in chapter 29, verse 3, in the first year of his reign, in the first month, he opened the doors of the house of the Lord and repaired them. In fact, it says, verse 17, they began to consecrate the house of God on the first day of the first month. So you think about that, like Hezekiah began a reformation on day one. The second they put Ahaz in the grave, Hezekiah began his reformation. He didn't wait a single day. On day one, he began doing things. And I think that's remarkable, because you think of any political leader that's ever been around, anybody that's been, made president, prime minister in this country, the advice would be, you've got all of these policies, just be a little bit patient, don't rock the boat too much. You need to kind of get in favor with the people first. So they might have all these ideas and policy changes, but they've got to be very careful of when or how they implement them, because, you don't want to upset the apple cart, they say. Hezekiah just bang. And I struggle to comprehend that, actually, because when it comes to doing things and making changes immediately, I'm not quite the best at those type of things in terms of taking action. In fact, you've heard the phrase, don't put off till tomorrow what you can do today. I kind of live on the theory of don't put off till tomorrow what you can do the next day. And I did this research on tomorrow, because I thought, well, tomorrow's kind of this thing in my life which is a big thing. It's a big day. So I discovered this thing about tomorrow. Tomorrow's a noun, and it means a mystical land where 99% of all human productivity, motivation, and achievement is stored. So tomorrow is this mystical land where everything happens. I'll do it tomorrow. It's all right. It's all right, dear. I'll do that tomorrow. It's kind of one of my favorite sort of sayings that you might say to your wife when she's got a few things that need to be done. And I don't know if you've ever seen some of Tim Urban's discussion on procrastination, and I think I may have shared this with some of you before, but I'll just share it quickly again with you because I think it's brilliant. I think it's absolutely brilliant. So Tim Urban and you can look this up on his TED Talks or on the internet. He talks a lot about, you know, what's behind procrastination, what you know makes people highly efficient and organized, versus people that are procrastinators and put things off. So people that are industrious and efficient versus procrastinators. And he says that he done a study on the difference between a procrastinator's brain and a efficient person's brain. And so they do an analysis and they look at two different brains and they follow the neurological paths to see what makes them the way they are. And so this is kind of a picture of that brain analysis, and it's pretty complex, you know, like when you look inside a brain, but this is the map of his brain. So so what he says, this is a non-procrastinator's brain. And he says, here in a non-procrastinator's brain, you've got somebody at the wheel. He's very organized. He's a rational decision maker. He says, I do things that make sense. I think long term. I am not a child. I'm very organized. And the only difference between this guy and the procrastinator's brain is it's exactly the same, but the procrastinator has this thing in here, the instant gratification monkey. And when he talks about the instant gratification monkey, which is something that I guess we all have, is, you know, you've got these things you need to do or want to do or have to do, these exams or studies or something you have to complete, series of talks, but the instant gratification monkey thinks, oh, look at that, so long as I do this by Friday, I can do this tonight, I'll be okay. And so instead of doing that, go online and play a few games of solitaire, play a couple of games of online chess, check your Facebook post 2 or 3 times, read the stuff in the New Zealand Herald 4 or 5 times because maybe the end of the world has occurred, check on the coronavirus numbers around, read the paper again, and then all of a sudden it gets to sort of 10 o'clock at night and it's like, oh, well, maybe I could do that tomorrow. And the procrastinator's brain is driven by this instant gratification monkey that always pushes out that deadline further and further. And then he talks about the fact that the one thing that the instant gratification monkey hates is the panic monster. And the panic monster is when that deadline gets so close that all of a sudden it's like, I've got to do all of this now. I can't keep putting it off. And the panic monster appears and the instant gratification monkey runs up a tree and runs away. And all of a sudden, the rational decision maker puts on his hat and away he goes. And it's a great sort of picture or analogy of how procrastination happens. But the key to this story, which is really something that Tim Urban doesn't deal with, is that I think the answer to someone like Hezekiah and the Lord Jesus Christ is that we often, or I often, in terms of the things I should be doing in serving God, are often put to the back because of things that I do that I enjoy more. That's the instant gratification. And you get in this guilty place because you're doing things which you're enjoying and you're feeling that I should actually be doing something else. I should be doing this. And so you're in this, guilty playground, as Tim Urban calls it, whilst you're serving your pleasures above your responsibilities. Now, the difference with people like Hezekiah and the Lord Jesus Christ, it says in Psalm 40, I delight to do thy will, O Lord. And the thing is that the service towards God was his greatest joy and greatest pleasure. And I think that's what comes out of Hezekiah's story, is Hezekiah was incredibly efficient because he delighted to do God's service. And so when you see the story of Hezekiah, he doesn't waste any time to start his cleansing of the temple. And you'll find that in 2 Chronicles chapter 29. So in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, as we said, it's day one, first month, first year, first day of his reign. He sets about to cleanse the temple. Now, in terms of contact tracing and finding a virus, the key to any virus is trying to find the index, patient 0, where the disease is at its heart. And for Hezekiah, he knew where the disease was at its heart. It happened in the days of Jeroboam, and it happened in the days of Uzziah, and it happened in the days of his father. He had corrupted the house of God, and that house needed deep cleansing. It needed the most efficient cleansing you can imagine. And so he organizes on the first day of his reign a group of people to deep clean the temple. And it takes them 16 days. It takes them in 2 parts, which is really interesting because there's like an 8-day period and another 8-day period. And when you look at the cleansing of the house of a leper, the house of a leper is shut up and cleaned for 7 days. And then on the 8th day, there's a re-inspection. And so when you go to Leviticus chapter 14 and you follow through the cleansing of a house of a leper, there's 2 inspections of the house of a leper. And this is what's taking place in Hezekiah's day. He is doing the house inspection, and he's going to cleanse the house of God. And this is where the contact tracing begins. And he chooses out these people to be with him in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 12 and 14. Chief appointed people out of the Levites and out of the rulers of the people. And in the prophecy of Micah, it says in Micah chapter 5, verse 5, when the Assyrian comes into the land, it says, we will raise against them 7 shepherds and 8 principal people. And it's just interesting that when you look at this section in 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 12 to 14, often you wonder why you get all these list of names listed here. Well, let me show you that there's actually 7, well, actually 6. So when you go through the list of the Levites here, it's detailed of who they are: Mahath, Joel, Kish, Azariah, Joah, Eden. And there's 6 Levites mentioned in 2 Chronicles chapter 29. 6 shepherds, as it were. But the record of Micah says we'll raise against him 7 shepherds. So there's a little question mark there on, is there a 7th one that's not being mentioned? Then it says 8 principal people, 8 principal men. And then there's a list here of 8 other people who are not of the Levites, who also help in this service: Shimri, Jael, Zechariah, Mattaniah, Jehoiah, Shemaiah, and Uzziel. So you've got in Hezekiah's day 8 principal men and 6 listed shepherds. And the answer to the 7th shepherd that is not listed there, of course, is the 7th shepherd is Hezekiah himself. Because it says in Micah chapter 5, he shall stand and shepherd his flock in the strength of the Lord. And that's the same root for the name of Hezekiah, strengthened of God, Hezekiah. And he will deliver us when the Assyrian comes into our land to tread within our borders. And Hezekiah is going to be the great shepherd of the sheep. He is the chief shepherd of those other shepherds and makes up the seventh, or perhaps we should say the first. And Lord Byron made a famous poem that said, when the Assyrian comes down like a wolf on the fold, and his cohorts were gleaming in purple and gold, and the sheen of his spears were like stars on the sea, when the blue waves rolled nightly on deep Galilee, which was a picture, of course, of the wolf coming down against the flock. And Micah's prophesying of a time that there will be a shepherd who will stand and deliver them at that time. Well, I think we shall stop there. We have a few more slides that we could look at, but we might look at those next week. So in summary, this is the beginning of Hezekiah's work in contact tracing. It starts with the house of God. Judgment begins at the house of God. It's exactly the way Jesus' ministry started when he went into the temple and overthrew the money chambers and said, "You've made my father's house a den of thieves." But that contact tracing of Hezekiah is going to stretch and reach, and it's going to go right from within the city of Jerusalem through Judea, even to the furthest parts of the northern kingdom of the nation of Israel, in an appeal for them to turn back to God. And the contact tracing to find the tentacles of where this virus was and to get to the root of it and to stamp it out is part of the process we're going to look at when we come back next week. And we're going to look at how Hezekiah strengthens the people and prepares them for what's going to be the second wave. And when the second wave comes, that's going to be a time of trouble such as never was for the nation of Israel.